This episode is not a tale of chaos or destruction, but a quiet meditation on transformation, on how a city built from wood, warmth and closeness was slowly remade into one of brick, stone and space. It is a story of light and renewal, of lives intertwined with the rhythm of fire, and of a city that, even in ruin, never stopped breathing. Listeners are gently invited to drift back to London in the year 1666, a place alive with trade and chatter, but fragile beneath its timber-bird skin. Through soft narration and vivid yet calming description, the story unfolds not as a catastrophe, but as a kind of slow metamorphosis, where the line between ending and beginning blurs like smoke in still air. Tone and atmosphere. The tone throughout is one of measured calm and quiet reflection. Each detail, the creak of wooden beams, the murmur of market stalls, the distant peal of church bells, is presented in a way that allows the listener to imagine, not react. Even moments of tension, such as the fire's spread, are delivered with a detached gentleness, inevitable, rhythmic, and strangely serene. The atmosphere balances intimacy and distance. The listener is softly addressed, invited to imagine yourself walking these streets, feeling the closeness of the walls, the warmth of hearth smoke in the air. Yet the narration never demands attention. It drifts like the listener's thoughts, allowing them to fade and return as naturally as breathing. Central motif: fire is both destroyer and creator. At the heart of this story lies the duality of fire, destructive yet purifying. In 1666, London's fire consumed homes, livelihoods, and centuries of history, but from those ashes rose a cleaner, safer, and more enduring city, one that still stands today. Throughout the narration, this theme recurs softly, almost unconsciously, in the glow of hearths, the flicker of candlelight, the warmth of sunrise over ruined stone. The fire becomes a symbol of transformation, not terror. It is treated as an element of nature, indifferent, powerful, and ultimately cleansing. Emotional arc. The story follows a slow descent and return from warmth, to flame, to silence, and back to renewal. The first act immerses the listener in the texture of daily life: cobblestones underfoot, bread baking, smoke curling lazily from chimneys, soft red and drift. Then comes the faint smell of smoke, a flicker at the edge of awareness. The narrative never shouts, it glows. Quiet destruction. As the fire spreads, the pacing slows further, transforming panic into inevitability. A city dissolving, not exploding. Ash and stillness. The aftermath brings silence, a soft gray stillness over blackened ground. Rebirth and reflection. Finally, the city stirs again. Brick replaces timber, order replaces confusion, and the tone becomes gently hopeful. By the end, the listener is left not with tension, but with peace, the sense that time smooths all edges, and that what once burned can be rebuilt stronger, steadier, and more enduring. Sensory landscape. The soundscape and imagery throughout the script will move through distinct but harmonized tones. Before the fire, warm, golden, bustling, the low hum of life in narrow streets. During the fire, muffled, wind-filled, luminous, the sound of distant crackling, bells ringing in slow cadence. After the fire, soft, muted, pale, the hush of settling ash, the whisper of rebuilding hands. This gentle sensory evolution mirrors the natural progression of a night's rest. Waking awareness gives slow drift, gives deep quiet, gives renewal, purpose, and listener experience. The video is meant to soothe while it teaches. For the sleepless, it offers a slow rhythm to follow the predictable comfort of steady narration and recurring imagery. For the curious, it paints an immersive historical world rich in texture and humanity. And for both, it ends in the same place: calm. Listeners should come away with a subtle understanding of how London, and by extension, civilization itself, survives change by embracing it. The story becomes a metaphor for endurance, even when all that was familiar turned to ash. Life found its way back, steady as the turning of the Thames. The night is calm over London. A gentle wind stirs the River Thames, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke and damp stone. Above the rooftops, a thin veil of mist clings to the air, neither fog nor cloud, but something in between, soft and luminous in the pale moonlight. The year is 1666. England is at peace again, though only just. The storms of civil war have passed, and the city hums with life, trade returning, laughter filling taverns, and church bells marking the hours with steady patience. This London is not yet the city of wide streets and marble facades that you may picture. It is older, closer, more intimate. It is a city of timber and pitch, of overhanging beams and crooked lanes, of chimneys that lean and chatter against the wind. If you were to walk its streets at this hour quietly so as not to wake the dogs, you might hear the whisper of the Thames against its wooden quays, the low murmur of a watchman's call, or the flutter of pigeons disturbed from their roosts. Every window glows faintly with candlelight, and from every hearth rises a small, comforting thread of smoke. Life in this London moves at the pace of daylight. At dawn, shutters open to the cry of traders. Bakers begin their work before the sun climbs, their ovens burning hot with dry wood and coal. Children run errands through the narrow alleys. Housewives fetch pails of water from the communal pump. The air is thick with the mingled smells of bread, tallow, horse dung, and tar, a living scent, neither pleasant nor foul, simply real. The houses themselves are close, so close that across some alleys neighbors can reach from one window to another and shake hands. The upper stories lean forward, shading the street below. Gutters overflow when it rains. Walls creak softly, doors swell with moisture, and smoke curls out of every chimney like breath from a sleeping city. Fire, in those days, was a constant companion. It warmed, it cooked, it lit the long hours of darkness, but it also waited, quietly, patiently in every spark, every candle, every stove, and yet the people of London lived comfortably alongside it, as one might live alongside a river that sometimes floods, or a wind that sometimes howls. It was simply part of life, a warmth that made survival possible, and danger that was too familiar to fear. In 1666, London was vast and living, a creature of wood, stone, and breath. Its heart beat in the markets of Cheapside, where goldsmiths' hammers rang in steady rhythm. It breathed along the Thames, where cargo ships lined the banks, barrels of wine from France, spices from the Indies, and bales of silk carried across oceans. The sound of hoofbeats echoed through its narrow lanes, and the cry of hawkers rose and fell like birdsong. The skyline was filled with church spires, nearly 100 of them, each marking its own parish, each with its bell calling out the time. At night, their bells fell silent, and the city's many hearths became its stars, flickering below the darkness instead of above it. It was, in every way, a living thing, and like all living things, it was vulnerable not only to the ambitions of kings or the march of armies, but to something smaller, quieter, and far more patient. Imagine, if you will, standing upon London Bridge just before dawn. The air is cool, the water below slow and black. To your left, the towers of the old medieval bridge rise, homes and shops built atop its stone arches. To your right, the city stretches outward like a field of wooden roofs, close and uneven, their chimneys rising like reeds. You hear a church bell, faint, distant, tolling 6 times. The city stirs. Somewhere, a dog barks. A milkmaid calls out to a sleepy customer. A baker in a narrow lane begins to open his shop, stirring embers in his oven to life. The smell of burning wood is ordinary, comforting even. No one notices the tiny, hungry flame that creeps along the edge of a pile of kindling. No one sees the spark that leaps to the ceiling beam. No one thinks that the glow in the darkness will soon be seen for miles. For now, the city sleeps still, wrapped in the warmth of its own familiarity. The river moves quietly, the wind gentle and low. If there is a sound beneath it all, it is the soft breathing of thousands of souls, merchants and servants, nobles and beggars, all resting beneath the same roof of smoke and starlight. In just a few hours, that breath will catch. The air itself will tremble, and a city of wood and warmth will begin its long transformation, not with thunder, but with a whisper. Before the fire came, there was a life ordinary, steady, and full. To understand what was lost, we must first walk slowly through what was the city of London in 1666, was alive with motion and sound. Yet there was a certain stillness to it, a rhythm that repeated day after day, familiar and comforting. Every street had its smell, its texture, its own particular sound. Every bell marked its hour. Every parish had its character, every shop its regular faces. Imagine, if you will, the first light of morning spilling over the rooftops, pale gold against the soot-dark chimneys, touching the weathered timbers of homes that had stood for generations. The day begins not with silence, but with gradual awakening. Somewhere in the east, near the river, a cockerel calls from a yard, then a second, and a third. Soon the muffled sounds of wooden shutters opening echo along the streets. Women lean from windows, shaking dust from rugs and cloth, their voices carrying faintly through the chill morning air. In the distance, the bells of St. Marylebone begin to ring the hour. Their tone is round and deep, not urgent, but steady, like a heartbeat. Below, the streets come to life. Apprentices sweep the doorways of their masters' shops, pushing away the dust and refuse that settled overnight. Water carriers walk slowly with their yokes and buckets, calling out in long-drawn syllables, "Water, fresh water." The smell of baking bread drifts from the bakeries, warm and yeasty, mixing with the sharp attempts of smoke from coal fires. Horses clatter on cobblestones. A cartwheel groans, and the hum of London begins once more. The city's streets are narrow in places, so tight that two carts cannot pass each other. Buildings lean inward, their upper stories jutting out over the road, their shadows falling like canopies. Many of these houses are half-timbered, wooden frames filled with plaster and wattle. Their beams are darkened by time, their plaster often painted in soft whites or pale ochres. Windows are small, filled with thick, uneven glass that bends the light into gentle distortions. The lanes twist and turn, never in straight lines. Names like Pudding Lane, Milk Street, Bread Street, Fish Hill, each tells you what once was traded there. The air carries those echoes still, and beneath the ground, the old medieval cellars remain dark, cool, and filled with barrels, rope, or salted meat. If you pause for a moment, you can hear it all. The murmur of conversation, the faint hammering from a blacksmith's forge, the clinking of a tavern door latch, the sigh of the river's tide. It is a city made not of noise, but of layers of sound, each distinct, yet blending into one long, living hum. The people of London in 1666 number nearly 500,000, one of the largest cities in Europe. Most are ordinary working folk, craftsmen, traders, laborers, servants. They rise early, work long, and end their day by candlelight. Their clothes are of wool and linen, practical and plain. The air is cool in the mornings, so shawls and cloaks are common, their folds heavy with the scent of hearth smoke. Children run barefoot through alleys, chasing each other between carts and market stalls. They know the city's rhythms by sound alone, when to run for bread, when to move for the watchman, when to scatter for the passing of a noble's carriage. Merchants in their fine coats stand before shops of cloth, spices and glassware imported from far-off lands. Apprentices work beside them, learning their trades with quiet diligence. The city is both ancient and young, rebuilt, expanded, and patched together like a quilt. Each person is bound, in some small way, to fire. A baker's oven, a blacksmith's forge, a candlemaker's vat, each depends upon flame to live. It is a tool, a friend, a constant hum at the edge of life. The air of London is heavy with scent, not unpleasant, but complex and alive. There is the sharp salt of the river, the sweetness of hay brought in from the countryside, the sourness of ale being brewed, and the warm, dry smell of bread. In poorer quarters, the air carries the musk of refuse, mingled with the smoke of peat fires and the tang of tallow candles. Everywhere, there is a faint background of burning 1,000 chimneys exhaling at once, their smoke drifting slowly upward, merging with the gray sky. It is the scent of life itself, constant, necessary, unremarkable. As the morning brightens, the market streets fill with life. Cheapside, the great thoroughfare of the city, becomes a river of sound. Merchants cry their wares, fresh mackerel, apples to a penny, fine ribbons from Flanders. Women haggle over loaves of bread, while messengers weave through the crowd with sealed letters tucked in leather satchels. The ground is uneven beneath foot, cobblestones slick with morning dew. If you were to stand still in the midst of it all, you would see movement everywhere, cloth fluttering in the breeze, the glint of polished pewter, the motion of hands exchanging coins. Somewhere nearby, a preacher stands on a wooden crate, delivering a sermon about sin and mercy. Few stop to listen. Most simply nod politely as they pass, the words of faith blending into the market's rhythm. Step away from the market, and the noise softens. In the quiet back streets you find rows of homes, some grand, others humble. Inside, the floors are laid with rushes or simple planks. The walls are low, the ceilings crossed by thick wooden beams. In nearly every home, the hearth is the center, the living flame around which life revolves. Families gather there at dusk, cooking simple meals of bread, broth, and ale. Children play at their parents' feet. The firelight flickers against their faces, reflecting in the metal of pots and spoons. Outside, the narrow lanes are lit by candles and windows. Lanterns sway from doorways, their glass panes fogged by soot. The city glows in thousands of small points of light, fragile stars that hold back the darkness. As the day fades, the mood of the city changes. Shops close their shutters. The cry of merchants grows faint. The bells toll once more, their echoes stretching long across the rooftops. In taverns, the low murmur of conversation and laughter begins. Tankards clink. The smell of ale and roasted meat drifts into the streets. Watchmen walk their rounds with lanterns in hand, calling softly into the night, "All's well, all's well." For many, this is the hour of rest. The streets empty, the sounds fall away, and the city once again exhales. Only the bakeries remain awake, their ovens glowing deep into the night. In one small shop on Pudding Lane, the master baker, Thomas Fariner, prepares the next morning's bread. His apprentices move quietly, stoking the coals, shaping dough, dusting flour across wooden tables. The air is warm, heavy with the scent of yeast and smoke. The baker yawns, content that his work is nearly done. He bangs the fire, closes the door, and retires for the night. Outside, the streets are empty. Only the watchman passes, lantern swinging gently. The city is silent now, utterly still, as if holding its breath. Above the rooftops, a faint wind rises from the east. It drifts softly through the chimneys, stirring the smoke. Somewhere unseen, a spark glows a little brighter. A coal shifts in its bed of ash. London sleeps unaware that in this moment, in this quiet hour before dawn, the air itself carries the first whisper of change. As the morning brightens, the market streets fill with life. Cheapside, the great thoroughfare of the city, becomes a river of sound. Merchants cry their wares: fresh mackerel, apples to a penny, fine ribbons from Flanders. Women haggle over loaves of bread, while messengers weave through the crowd with sealed letters tucked in leather satchels. The ground is uneven beneath foot cobblestones, slick with morning dew. If you were to stand still in the midst of it all, you would see movement everywhere, cloth fluttering in the breeze, the glint of polished pewter, the motion of hands exchanging coins. Somewhere nearby, a preacher stands on a wooden crate, delivering a sermon about sin and mercy. Few stop to listen. Most simply nod politely as they pass, the words of faith blending into the market's rhythm. Step away from the market, and the noise softens. In the quiet back streets you find rows of homes, some grand, others humble. Inside, the floors are laid with rushes or simple planks. The walls are low, the ceilings crossed by thick wooden beams. In nearly every home, the hearth is the center, the living flame around which life revolves. Families gather there at dusk, cooking simple meals of bread, broth, and ale. Children play at their parents' feet. The firelight flickers against their faces, reflecting in the metal of pots and spoons. Outside, the narrow lanes are lit by candles and windows. Lanterns sway from doorways, their glass panes fogged by soot. The city glows in thousands of small points of light, fragile stars that hold back the darkness. As the day fades, the mood of the city changes. Shops close their shutters. The cry of merchants grows faint. The bells toll once more, their echoes stretching long across the rooftops. In taverns, the low murmur of conversation and laughter begins. Tankards clink. The smell of ale and roasted meat drifts into the streets. Watchmen walk their rounds with lanterns in hand, calling softly into the night, "All's well, all's well." For many, this is the hour of rest. The streets empty, the sounds fall away, and the city once again exhales. Only the bakeries remain awake, their ovens glowing deep into the night. In one small shop on Pudding Lane, the master baker, Thomas Fariner, prepares the next morning's bread. His apprentices move quietly, stoking the coals, shaping dough, dusting flour across wooden tables. The air is warm, heavy with the scent of yeast and smoke. The baker yawns, content that his work is nearly done. He bangs the fire, closes the door, and retires for the night. Outside, the streets are empty. Only the watchman passes, lantern swinging gently. The city is silent now, utterly still, as if holding its breath. Above the rooftops, a faint wind rises from the east. It drifts softly through the chimneys, stirring the smoke. Somewhere unseen, a spark glows a little brighter. A coal shifts in its bed of ash. London sleeps unaware that in this moment, in this quiet hour before dawn, the air itself carries the first whisper of change. The city sleeps beneath a blanket of soft darkness. The moon, half hidden by drifting cloud, casts a pale shimmer across the rooftops. Chimneys stand still and silent, their smoke long faded into the night. Within the wooden houses, candles have gutted out. Fires, banked carefully in their hearths, glow faintly beneath layers of ash. It is quiet now, the kind of deep, breathing silence that only comes before dawn. The air is cool, still. The faint wind that had stirred at sunset has calmed. Even the river seems hushed, the tide turning gently against the banks. And yet somewhere on Pudding Lane, in a small bakehouse filled with the lingering scent of flour and smoke, a single coal glows a little too brightly. It begins with something so small that no one notices. Perhaps a draft slips through a crack in the oven door. Perhaps a spark leaps higher than it should, landing upon a piece of wood long dried from years of use. The ember breathes once, then twice, and then very softly it catches. The wood darkens, then glows, then blisters. A thin line of smoke curls upward, faint and ghost-like, into the darkness. At first, there is no flame, only the slow, deep heat of smoldering timber. The smell of char rises, blending with the sweet scent of baked bread, a sound like faint paper tearing. A sigh, then at last a flicker. A flame no higher than a candle's tongue finds the air. It trembles, it leans, and then it begins to feed. In the stillness of the bakery, light begins to move. It creeps along the wall, searching, finding more wood, more straw, more air. The fire grows quietly, almost elegantly, a soft fluttering of orange and gold. It climbs the wall, dances along the ceiling beams, and spreads into the rafters where dry flour dust hangs in the air. The flame and the dust meet, and for an instant, the world flashes white, a soft muffled hump, and suddenly, the small room is alive. Sparks rain down like stars. A pan topples. Wood splits with a sharp, clean crack. Outside, the street remains silent. A dog lifts its head, uncertain, then curls back into sleep. Within the bakery, the fire has found its rhythm. It whispers, it breathes, and in its breathing, it begins to consume. Sometime after midnight, a servant wakes. The air smells wrong, thick, sharp, and warm. He opens the door to the bakehouse and is met by a wall of red. The light is dazzling. Heat rushes out in a sudden wave. He stumbles back, shouting for help, but his words dissolve into the roar of the flames. Within moments, the narrow wooden stairs are alight. The timbers crack and groan. A window bursts inward, sucking air into the blaze. The baker's family escapes into the street, barefoot, dazed, clutching what they can. Behind them, the bakehouse is a furnace. The flames leap outward, finding the neighboring houses homes built of the same dry timber, the same tarred rope, the same thatch and pitch. In seconds, fire becomes movement. In minutes, movement becomes hunger. The bells of St. Margaret's begin to ring slow, uncertain, a warning that wavers between confusion and alarm. People open their shutters and lean into the glow, squinting into the night. At first, many believe it to be nothing more than a chimney fire, common, contained, ordinary. But as they watch, they see the light brighten, they hear the low rhythmic roar, they feel the warmth on their faces from a street away. And then, the realization spreads not with words, but with silence. A silence that deepens as the flames rise. Shortly before dawn, a wind begins to stir again, this time from the east. It starts as a gentle sigh, then grows stronger, pushing down the narrow lanes. The fire breathes it in greedily. Flames bend with the gusts, reaching across alleys, licking at shutters, at roofs, at ropes of drying laundry. The wind carries embers through the air, small, glowing seeds that drift and settle, landing upon thatch, upon wood, upon cloth. Each one finds its place, each one kindles. In a city built of timber, every rooftop becomes a wick. The fire moves not in lines, but in leaps. One street catches, then the next. The bells ring faster now. A steady rhythm of alarm spreads from church to church, from Pudding Lane to Fish Street Hill, and onward toward Eastchip. The glow spreads like dawn, but this is no dawn. Buckets appear, lines of men form along the street, passing water from the river in slow, desperate rhythm. The water sloshes, spilling onto cobblestones, but the fire laughs at their efforts. The wooden homes packed tightly together carry the flames upward and outward. The heat is immense, so fierce that the water turns to steam before it touches the walls. The mayor arrives, called from his sleep, his nightcap still on his head. He peers into the fire's light and mutters, "A woman might piss it out." He leaves soon after. The city, for now, must fend for itself. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the fire has taken the heart of Pudding Lane. By 3, it reaches Fish Hill. The sound of collapsing roofs echoes through the streets long. Heavy sighs of surrender. People flee with what they can carry, chests, blankets, children. They move slowly, in dazed silence. The glow reflects in their eyes. Embers float like snowflakes, soft and orange, settling upon their shoulders. Everywhere, there is motion, carts, horses, footsteps, yet it feels strangely dreamlike, as if the city itself is moving in slow motion. The wind drives the fire onward, pushing it toward the river. Ships anchored there catch alight one by one, their sails turning to sheets of fire that drift upon the tide. Reflections shimmer on the water, turning the Thames into a river of gold. The flames are not violent in the way we imagine. They move with grace, rising, bending, twirling in slow, endless patterns. They dance upon the rooftops, climb the steeples, and slip between rafters like living things. In the silence between each collapse, you can hear it breathing, the deep, constant murmur of flame-consuming air. People stand at a distance, watching. Some pray aloud. Others simply stare, unable to look away. A mother clasps her child, whispering softly, "We'll go when it's closer," but the fire is already closer. It moves like water, silent until it touches you, then unstoppable. As dawn breaks, the sky turns red, not from the sun but from the reflection of thousands of burning rooftops. Smoke gathers into columns, rising straight and tall before bending with the wind. Ash falls like snow, settling on faces, on clothes, on the river's edge. The air tastes of salt and iron. The heat is so great that glass melts in the windows. Metal buckles, stone cracks. The sound is no longer a roar, but a low, continuous thunder. The city itself, breathing, breaking, collapsing in on its own heat. From the tower of St. Magnus the Martyr, the bells begin to warp and melt. Their tones grow strange and mournful, like voices calling across the smoke. By midday, the fire stretches in every direction. The lines between street and sky blur. All is flame and smoke and light. Even the shadows glow. The wind shifts again, carrying the fire northward toward Cheapside. It leaps across open spaces once thought safe. Barrels of tar ignite in the warehouses near the river. The explosions roll like distant thunder, and yet, within the noise, there is still a peculiar peace. People move in silence, as if walking through snow. No one runs. There is nowhere to run to. By the end of that long night, the city no longer breathes as it once did. The streets of Pudding Lane are gone. The homes are embers. The air glows dull and red, filled with drifting sparks that refuse to fade. Far away, the wind carries the fire onward, toward new streets, new homes, new dreams to consume. In the ashes of the bakery, the first coals still pulse faintly, a memory of what began it all. And somewhere above, through the smoke and drifting embers, the church bells of St. Paul's toll faintly, a hollow, trembling sound that seems to come not from metal, but from the heart of the city itself. When at last the fire began to tire, London fell into a silence so deep it felt almost sacred. The wind softened. The smoke rose in thin, weary columns, curling lazily into the sky. The roar that had filled the air for days gave way to something quieter, the sound of things cooling, of stones settling, of timbers sighing into ash. For 4 days and nights, the city had burned without pause. Now, in the pale light of early morning, the fire was gone, or rather, it had nothing left to take. The streets lay buried beneath grey dust. Walls stood like blackened ribs, their edges still glowing faintly red. Where once there had been homes, markets, and laughter, there was now only emptiness. The air was heavy with the scent of smoke and wet charcoal. It clung to everything, to hair, to clothes, to breath itself. Even the Thames, cool and slow, carried a sheen of ash upon its surface. And yet, in that terrible stillness there was a strange kind of peace. The danger had passed. The world had stopped its trembling. What remained was quiet, the quiet that comes after great change. At first, no one knew where the city began anymore. Streets had vanished beneath heaps of stone. Landmarks were unrecognizable. The familiar pathways of daily life from Cheapside to Pudding Lane, from St. Paul's to the river, had all dissolved into a vast, grey plain. And yet, as the smoke cleared, the people began to return. They came cautiously, stepping over fallen beams, moving through clouds of dust that rose with every footstep. Many carried keys to doors that no longer existed. Others searched the ruins for signs of what had been: a piece of ironwork, a bit of pottery, a single brick still warm from the fire. There were tears, yes, but there was also a kind of awe at the scale of it, at the sheer stillness of a city once alive. They said the fire had consumed 13,000 homes, 87 churches, nearly 400 streets. It was destruction on a scale that few could comprehend. And yet, among the ashes, people still moved, quietly rebuilding in small ways. A mother gathering stones to mark where her home had stood. A bookseller picking through charred pages. A child drawing lines in the soot with a stick, as if sketching the city anew. Imagine yourself standing on what was once Cheapside, the heart of old London. The air is still warm beneath your feet. Every step stirs up a faint grey mist. The skyline, once crowded with rooftops and spires, now stretches open and bare, a flat sea of ruin that reaches to the horizon. St. Paul's Cathedral, once the city's proudest monument, stands blackened and broken. Its great roof has fallen in. The stone walls, scorched and split, are still hot to the touch. Around it lie heaps of twisted lead. The roof itself, melted and run like wax into strange silver pools. People gather there in silence. Some kneel and pray. Others simply watch, their faces unreadable. It is difficult to imagine rebuilding when so much has vanished. And yet, beneath the ash, the city's foundations remain not only of stone and earth, but of memory. Days pass, the smell of smoke fades, replaced by the damp scent of rain on ash. The fires that still smolder beneath the ruins die out one by one. And then, slowly, the rhythm of life begins again. At first, it is small. A tent is raised along the riverbank, a makeshift shop. Someone begins selling bread from a cart. Someone else opens a stall of salvaged goods. Within weeks, thousands are living in temporary shelters. Canvas and timber fill the empty spaces where houses once stood. The city hums faintly again, quieter, humbler, but alive. The king himself, Charles II, walks the ruins. He speaks softly with the people. He promises that London will rise again, and that this time it will be safer, cleaner, built not of wood but of stone. It is a comforting thought, though the work will take years. Among those who walk the ruins is a man named Christopher Wren, a scholar, an astronomer, and an architect with a mind full of symmetry and light. He looks upon the empty landscape not with sorrow, but with imagination. Where others see loss, he sees possibility. He sketches as he walks broad boulevards instead of alleys, open squares instead of crowded yards, churches crowned with graceful domes instead of leaning spires. He imagines London as a city reborn from fire, spacious, elegant, enduring. A city of stone and air. The plans he draws are ambitious, almost dreamlike. In them, the city breathes differently, wide avenues letting the wind pass through, sunlight reaching even the narrowest streets. It is a London that might have been Paris or Rome. But time, as always, moves more slowly than dreams. Land ownership is complex. People rebuild upon their old plots, and so the city's medieval heart remains but changed. Not entirely new, not entirely old. From Wren's grand designs, only parts are realized. But one of those parts would rise higher and stronger than any that came before the new St. Paul's Cathedral. Stone by stone, the new cathedral begins to take shape. Its foundation is laid upon the same hill where the old one fell. This time the work is patient, measured and made to last. Wren's design grows slowly upward. Great arches, soaring pillars, and a dome that seems to float above the skyline. Years pass, decades, even generations come and go while the work continues. Children born after the fire grow old before the final stones are set. And when at last it is done, St. Paul's rises white and calm above the city, not a monument to tragedy, but to endurance. The light that falls upon its dome seems softer somehow, as if passing through memory itself. For many years afterward, Londoners spoke of the fire not as a single event, but as a kind of turning of the age. There was the city before the fire, dark, close, and wooden, and the city after, broader, brighter, and made of stone. Some said the fire was punishment. Others called it cleansing. Most simply called it the Great Fire, as if no other name could contain its enormity. Children born long after still heard the stories told at night, of the baker's spark, of the winds that fed it, of the bells that melted, and the city that vanished in smoke. And though the ashes had long since been cleared, the memory remained in the rhythm of the streets, in the new stone walls, in the wider lanes, in the quiet respect people held for the power of fire. Today, if you walk through London, you can still trace the path of that fire, not in the flames, but in the spaces it left behind. Pudding Lane still exists, narrow and unassuming, though few who walk it feel the echo beneath their feet. The new St. Paul's still stands, serene and pale against the skyline, its dome rising from the same ground that once burned red. The streets hum now with cars instead of horses, with voices instead of bells. But beneath the sound, beneath the pavement itself, lies that same heartbeat, the quiet persistence of a city that has burned and risen again. London does not forget. It endures, in wood and in stone, in loss and in rebirth. And so, the story of the Great Fire of London ends not in despair, but in calm renewal. A city of wood became a city of stone. A city of narrow shadows became one of open light. What was once consumed was rebuilt slowly, patiently, as only time and hands together can rebuild. The fire did not end London. It changed it quietly, irrevocably, shaping the rhythm of its future. Imagine now the same streets, quiet beneath the modern lights. Imagine standing upon London Bridge once more, as we did at the beginning of our journey. The river still flows, slow and reflective. The city still hums, alive as ever. But somewhere, deep within its history, a small ember still glows, not of flame, but of memory. A warmth that speaks of endurance, of change, and of the calm that follows every storm. The morning after the fire ended, London stood motionless beneath a pale, washed-out sky. The air was thick with a haze of ash that glowed faintly in the dawn. What had once been a city of roofs and chimneys now lay flattened, silent, and gray. The smoke still rose in thin, twisting columns, faint wisps, here and there, like ghosts reluctant to leave. Streets were gone, landmarks vanished. Even the river seemed changed, slower, darker, reflecting the emptiness above. And yet, even here, life stirred. From the edges of the ruins came the first sounds of movement, boots crunching on brittle ash, the clatter of a pail, the low murmur of voices speaking carefully, as though afraid to disturb the silence. They were Londoners, bakers, blacksmiths, tailors, sailors, widows, apprentices, ordinary people returning to what had been their lives. Each step forward felt like both discovery and loss. They came not only to see what remained, but to begin again. The work began slowly. First they cleared the fallen beams, great blackened ribs of houses now half buried in cinders. Then came the stone, some still too hot to touch. Even days later, teams of men with carts and ropes began to haul it away, the wheels creaking through the dust. The smell of smoke clung to everything, to hands, to clothes, to breath. It mingled with the scent of wet earth and sweat, forming a strange, familiar perfume, the smell of work. Children helped where they could, stacking bricks into small piles, carrying buckets of water to wet the dust. Women sifted through debris, searching for any sign of what had once been home. A silver spoon, half melted, a shard of china, blue and white beneath the soot, a lock of iron still bearing the shape of a door. Every object recovered was both treasure and memory, a small piece of a world lost. By the second week, the ruins began to take on shape again, not of buildings, but of spaces cleared. The faint outlines of streets reappeared, traced in pale dust like veins upon the skin of the earth. Around the edges of the city, tents began to rise, simple ones at first. Canvas stretched between poles, tied with rope, patched with scraps of old sailcloth. Then more permanent shelters, small timber huts, neat and orderly, built upon open ground at Moorfields and Smithfield. Families lived there together, entire neighborhoods reformed beneath the open sky. The nights were cool, the days long and filled with labor. From the distance, the camps looked almost peaceful, white shapes scattered across the dark earth, faint smoke rising from cooking fires. Children played among them, their laughter a soft reminder that life continued. Merchants reopened their stalls. Bakers began again, this time in makeshift ovens of stone. The city's pulse, faint but steady, began to return. King Charles II walked the ruins not long after the smoke cleared. He rode slowly through the devastated streets, his horse's hooves echoing against the cracked stones. The people watched him pass in silence, not in fear or anger, but in a kind of shared disbelief. He dismounted and spoke softly to those nearby, promising help, promising that London would rise again, stronger, safer, and more beautiful. "Let it be of stone," he said, more than once. "No more timber walls, no more narrow alleys to trap the flames. A city built for the ages." His calm presence gave a measure of comfort. In the quiet of the ashes, such words felt solid, like foundations being laid. Even before the first stone was set, soon after, Parliament passed new laws, the Rebuilding Acts. They ordered that all new houses be made of brick or stone, not wood. Street widths were increased, fire breaks were required. Surveyors were sent to redraw the map of the city, their measuring rods cutting straight lines across what had once been a maze of medieval lanes. Property owners gathered in small crowds, arguing softly but persistently over boundaries that had been erased by fire. One man's cellar now lay beneath another's pile of rubble. A wall that once divided to homes was gone entirely. And so, with patience and negotiation, the city's bones were traced again slowly, carefully, and with many pauses for thought. It was not the quick, grand rebuilding of imagination. It was something humbler, quieter, a reconstruction of habits, of streets, of the familiar. The London that rose from the ashes would not be a dream, but a memory rebuilt in stronger form. Among the surveyors and planners walked a few men of vision, Christopher Wren, Robert Hooke, and others who saw beyond the ruins. They spoke of wide avenues, of great piazzas and open spaces, of public squares and long, clean lines of stone. Wren imagined a city that would breathe free of the close, shadowed lanes that had fed the flames. He drew plans that looked almost like stars, broad radial streets spreading outward from a shining center. At the heart stood a new cathedral, vast and luminous, its dome rising like the morning sun. For a brief moment, London might have become something entirely new, the first modern city, but reality, as it often does, moved differently. Land was precious. Ownership complex. People were impatient to rebuild. And so, one by one, Ren's grand lines gave way to the old ones. The city's familiar pattern returned, crooked, irregular, but alive. Still, not all of his vision was lost. From the fire came opportunity to widen the streets, to open the spaces, to raise new churches, and to crown them with that dome, St. Paul's, reborn. The rebuilding of London was not the work of architects alone. It was the labor of thousands: masons, bricklayers, carpenters, glassmakers, blacksmiths, each working slowly, patiently, one stone at a time. From quarries across England came cartloads of Portland stone, pale and smooth beneath the sun. Ships carried it up the Thames, where cranes lifted it ashore, the ropes creaking under weight. In every street the sound of work became the new heartbeat of the city, the measured rhythm of hammers upon chisels, the scrape of trowels spreading mortars, the soft calls of men signaling one another across the scaffolds. Dust hung in the air again, but this time it was not ash, it was the dust of creation. By day, the sun lit the half-built walls in warm tones of gold and ivory. By night, lamps burned low, flickering upon the faces of men who worked long past sunset. They built slowly, deliberately, with the calm certainty of those who knew that haste had once destroyed what patience could now preserve. As the buildings rose, so did life. The bells began to ring again, not in alarm, but in time. Shops reopened, inns returned. The river, once filled with floating debris, now carried barges loaded with stone and timber. The old markets were rebuilt, their stalls once more filled with fruit, cloth, and bread. Children chased one another along the half-paved streets. A city that had once been ashes now smelled again of baking, of earth, of horses and rain. There were new rules, new designs, but the same rhythm, the slow, patient breathing of London itself. The walls that rose were thicker, steadier, more permanent. Each brick carried the memory of what had been lost, a quiet tribute to fragility made solid. Some said the city had become too cold, too clean, too straight, but most agreed it felt safe. And after years of fear and flame, safety was beauty enough. The new churches designed by Ren and his pupils dotted the skyline, small jewels of stone and light. Their towers rose above the rooftops like calm sentinels, keeping watch over the city that had burned and lived again. And in the evenings, when the last rays of sunlight caught the pale stone, it glowed softly as if the fire still lingered there, tamed and transformed into light. By the time the century turned, the scars of the Great Fire had faded into history. A generation had passed. Those who remembered the flames were old now, their stories told in gentle tones beside warm hearths. London had become something new, a city both ancient and reborn, a place of strength and memory, where every wall, every street, every curve of stone whispered the same quiet message: we endure. Imagine yourself there now, walking along one of those new streets, the air cool, the stones beneath your feet solid and smooth. The faint sound of bells echoes through the evening air. The city glows softly in the fading light, calm, enduring, alive. And somewhere in the distance, above the rooftops, the great dome of St. Paul's rises like a moon, a reminder that from ash and silence, beauty can still be built. When the fire finally burned itself out, and the first stones were laid for rebuilding, London was neither alive nor dead. It existed somewhere in between, a vast grey plain of ruin, pulsing faintly with signs of persistence. The people who stayed behind were not the rich or the powerful. They had other homes, country estates or family lands to retreat to. It was the ordinary Londoners who remained. The bakers, the sailors, the coopers, the widows, the apprentices, the washerwomen. They were bound to this city not by wealth, but by habit, memory, and necessity. Each morning they emerged from their tents or wooden huts, stepping out into streets that had no names anymore, only directions. Where the church used to be, down toward the old market, past the place that burned. Every direction was a memory. Every path walked was a ghost of what had once been there. Yet somehow life resumed its rhythm, slowly, cautiously, unhurried. By early 1667. London had become a city of makeshift existence. Canvas roofs flapped softly in the wind. Wooden stalls lined the open grounds, selling bread, coal, and salt. The smell of smoke still lingered, faint but permanent, the scent of something that had once burned and refused to be forgotten. The temporary markets grew into bustling little worlds of their own. At Moorfields, merchants laid out their goods upon rough tables. There were bakers who sold small loaves blackened by the simplest of ovens, tailors who mended clothes beside open fires, and children who sold pins, matches, and scraps of cloth. It was a fragile economy, but it moved like the steady trickle of a stream finding its way through stone. People adapted. They built and rebuilt every day. Some slept in makeshift shacks built from the beams of their old homes. Others found shelter in the crypts of churches that still stood, the stone walls cool, the air heavy but safe. And at night, the city glowed faintly again, not with fire, but with the warm, flickering light of 1,000 small lamps. Food was scarce in the first months. The great bakeries were gone, and with them, the familiar rhythm of bread ovens warming at dawn. Flour had to be brought in by boat, up the Thames, where mills on the outskirts of the city still turned. Those who could, baked at home, small, smoky fires beneath iron pots, the smell of singed dough mingling with ash. The bread was often hard, unevenly cooked, but it was enough to keep one alive. Water came from public pumps, many of which had survived. Crowds gathered around them each morning, filling buckets, chatting softly. In those moments, the rhythm of community returned. Shared patience, shared waiting. Londoners grew accustomed to improvisation. A door became a table, a barrel, a chair. Walls were made from scavenged bricks and old planks. And yet, amid all this, there was a kind of quiet dignity, a steadiness born from centuries of living close to hardship. If you stood in the middle of London in those years and closed your eyes, you would hear a different city. Gone were the bells and carriages, the shouts of traders in crowded alleys. Instead, there was the soft thud of shovels, the creak of carts, the chatter of sparrows returning to roofs that no longer existed. The soundscape was one of labor and renewal, the sigh of wind through scaffolds, the scrape of trowels against stone, the distant ring of hammers shaping the new city. At dusk, those sounds faded, replaced by laughter from the camps, faint, tired, but real. Songs were sung again, though softly, as though the city itself was not yet ready for joy. For many, faith offered the only sense of permanence. Though so many churches had burned, their bells cracked and their towers fallen, their churchyards remained. It was there that people gathered on Sundays, standing in open air as the ministers preached from temporary pulpits made of planks. The congregations were smaller, quieter, but there was comfort in the rhythm, the same prayers, the same hymns, sung against a backdrop of emptiness. Children played among gravestones that leaned at strange angles. The living and the dead shared that sacred space, as they always had, and from those gatherings came a renewed sense of unity, a calm, steady belief that the city would endure, as faith had endured. As months turned to years, the docks of the Thames came alive again. Ships arrived carrying stone, timber, slate, iron, and people. Workers came from other towns, drawn by the promise of employment in the rebuilding. Merchants reopened their warehouses along the river. The air filled again with the rhythmic cries of stevedores and the groan of loaded cranes. Inns and taverns, rebuilt in simple form, began to serve customers again. By evening, candlelight glowed through paper-covered windows, and the murmur of conversation drifted through the narrow lanes. The city was still half a ruin, but it was a ruin in motion. It was alive. A generation of children grew up in this in-between London, a city of ash, scaffolding, and open skies. They played among the piles of broken brick, climbing them as if they were hills. They learned to find beauty in what remained, the glint of a glass fragment, the pattern on a piece of burned tile. They had no memory of the old, crowded London. To them, the city was wide and open, full of possibility. Their laughter carried through the streets like birdsong after a storm for these children. The Great Fire was not a tragedy, but a story their parents told, a story of something that had ended before their own world began. The fire had destroyed not only buildings but also property lines, legal documents, and debts. To address the confusion, special fire courts were established. Held in the Guildhall, these courts worked quickly, with surprising fairness. Judges listened to disputes about where one house ended and another began, about who owned a wall, a doorway, a patch of earth. Most cases ended in compromise. It was a quiet, bureaucratic miracle, a rare moment in history when order rose gently from chaos. The people accepted the rulings and moved on, grateful for any resolution that allowed them to begin again. Every decision written down became another step toward normalcy. It is easy to imagine despair in such a setting, but the letters and diaries that survive tell another story, one of endurance, humor, and acceptance. A tailor named John Evelyn wrote of walking through the ruins and hearing laughter. A widow named Margaret, living in a tent near Fleet Street, recorded in her diary how she began to sell pies made from scraps of meat and flour, small, yet plentiful, she wrote, for none had coin enough for more. People married, children were born, and life threaded its way through the cracks. What had been destroyed became, slowly, a backdrop for ordinary living once again. At night, the city turned soft. Smoke from the cooking fires drifted low across the ruins. The voices grew quieter, conversations shorter. Many sat together outside their tents, watching the faint glow of new buildings rising in the distance. The sound of hammering sometimes carried into the night, steady, rhythmic, reassuring. In that sound, people heard more than work. They heard continuity. They heard the pulse of a city determined not to fade away. Over time, as walls rose and roofs were laid, the people began to move back into their neighborhoods. Streets regained their names, and doorways their owners. The scent of bread returned to the mornings, and in the evenings, church bells rang again. Steady, like a heartbeat rediscovered. For those who had stayed through the ruin, the new London felt both familiar and strange. The air seemed cleaner, the light wider, but beneath it all ran the same current, the same pulse of human life that had carried them through the ashes. They had not only survived the fire, they had become its witnesses, its caretakers, its quiet victors. Imagine for a moment, one of them, a mason, sitting on a half-built wall as the sun sets behind St. Paul's new rising dome. His hands are white with stone dust. The air smells faintly of lime and river mist. He looks out across the city, the scaffolds, the camps, the narrow alleys that are slowly returning. He has no thought of legacy, no grand plan, only the quiet satisfaction of having stayed. And as night falls, he stands, brushes off the dust, and walks home past the ruins that are no longer ruins, past the walls that hum faintly with the sound of tomorrow. Every city begins as an idea. Before the walls, before the streets, before the sound of footsteps, there is always an image in someone's mind, a vision of how life might flow from one place to another. A thought of how sunlight might fall on a doorway, or how a tower might rise against the sky. After the Great Fire, London was reduced to a blank slate, an empty parchment stretched across miles of ruin. For a brief, fleeting moment, it was possible to imagine something entirely new. A city reborn from its own ashes, ordered, beautiful, logical. The fire had erased the old medieval maze of alleys and overhanging roofs. Now, for the first time, there was room to think about space, about breath, light, and form. And into that silence, the architects began to dream. Among those who dreamed was a man named Christopher Wren. At the time of the fire, he was not yet known primarily as an architect. He was an astronomer, a mathematician, a thinker, a man who studied the heavens and sought patterns in everything he saw. He was joined by Robert Hooke, another mind of restless brilliance. Hooke was a physicist, an inventor, a surveyor. He could take a world in pieces and see how each part fit together again. From the turning of the planets to the gears of a clock, the two men were friends, collaborators, sometimes rivals bound by the same hunger to understand how things were built and how they might be rebuilt better. When London burned, their minds turned from the sky to the ground beneath their feet. They saw not only destruction, but possibility. Before anything could be designed, the city had to be measured anew. Every street, every surviving foundation, every boundary line. Robert Hooke, appointed one of the surveyors of the city, walked for months through the grey dust, sketching and noting. He carried instruments, measuring chains, compasses, and a small field book. He mapped the ruins street by street, quietly redrawing the ghost of the city that had been. Imagine him there, a man moving through silence, coat brushing against scorched walls, the sound of his boots on crushed brick. He pauses at a corner, lifts his compass, marks a point, then moves on, step by patient step, measuring what was lost, so that it might someday be restored. By the time his survey was complete, London existed once more, not in stone, but in ink, a faint, delicate outline of what could be. While Hooke measured, Wren imagined. He drew broad avenues radiating from central squares, sweeping toward the Thames like spokes of a wheel. He envisioned wide boulevards lined with uniform facades, open spaces for markets, gardens, and churches that rose with classical symmetry. His plan resembled the great European cities of the time, Paris, Rome, Amsterdam, but imbued with something uniquely English, restraint, balance, and quiet grace. In Wren's mind, the new London would be not only practical but beautiful, a reflection of divine order. Every line would lead toward the heart of the city, St. Paul's Cathedral, reborn as its serene centerpiece. When he presented his drawings to King Charles II, the monarch was impressed, but reality was less accommodating than imagination. Property ownership, debts, and human attachment to the familiar made sweeping transformation impossible. The people wanted their plots, their corners, their doorways, just as they had been. The fire had taken enough. They would not surrender their homes to geometry, and so Wren's grand map, those broad sunlit avenues, remained mostly on paper. Yet even as Wren's dream city faded from possibility, another quieter vision took its place. Hook's practical mind began shaping what could actually be done, not the city of ideals, but the city of survival. He worked tirelessly, drawing new street lines that followed the old paths but straightened them just enough to allow better movement and drainage. He designed modest, efficient houses built of brick and stone, resistant to flame. He enforced regulations that limited the use of timber, widened the streets, and raised the standards of safety. Through his careful, almost invisible labor, the London we know today began to take form not as a masterpiece drawn by a single hand, but as 1,000 small adjustments made with quiet intelligence. Hook was not a man given to poetry, but his city, measured, practical, enduring, became a poem of its own kind. Long after the flames had cooled and the last embers died, London still carried the warmth of the fire in memory. It was not a visible warmth, but something quieter, a kind of pulse that ran beneath the cobblestones. A reminder that once everything familiar had vanished in a single breath of wind. The fire had changed more than the shape of streets. It had changed how people thought about the city itself. No longer just a collection of homes and markets, it had become something more, a shared story, a lesson in both fragility and endurance. Every generation that followed would find the fire waiting in the corners of their imagination, a whisper from the past, a cautionary glow. In the years after 1666, the Great Fire became a story told again and again around hearths, in taverns, in classrooms, and in quiet evening walks. It was retold so often that it began to take on the shape of legend. Children grew up hearing of Thomas Fariner, the baker of Pudding Lane, and his forgotten spark. Some said it was an accident, others whispered it was fate. Rumors took hold that the fire had been started deliberately, a tale born of fear in uncertain times. Foreigners were blamed, Catholics accused, even the French were whispered about in dark corners. But with time, those angry stories faded, leaving behind something gentler, an understanding that the fire, like a storm, had simply been part of nature's unpredictable rhythm. The story softened, becoming part of the city's folklore, a spark in a bakery, a wind that would not stop, a city that rose again. It was repeated so often that it stopped belonging to any one person. It became a shared dream, or perhaps a shared warning. When the monument was completed in 1677, it stood as both memorial and teacher. Its inscription spoke of loss, resilience, and renewal. At its base, carved in patient lines of Latin, were the words that captured the city's resolve. London rises again. People came to see it as they might visit a grave. Though no one was buried there, they climbed its spiral staircase, 311 steps, winding upward through the hollow column, until they reached the viewing platform, where the air was cool and the wind soft, and the whole of the city stretched out below, alive again. Children pressed their hands to the stone. Older visitors leaned quietly against the railing, looking down at the rebuilt streets, and thought of what once was. There, on clear days, the city's story felt whole again, past and present meeting in one long breath. Writers and artists turned their eyes to the fire for centuries afterward. They found in it not only destruction, but transformation. The diarist Samuel Pepys, who had watched the fire from a small boat on the Thames, preserved its first great eyewitness account, his words calm, observant, and strangely intimate. He wrote of the orange glow reflected on the water, of the wind scattering sparks like stars, of the quiet despair in people's faces as they fled. Later, painters like Joseph Mallord, William Turner would take those same images, the glow, the wind, the reflection, and turn them into something mythic. In his paintings, the fire became less a disaster than an element, a vast golden force that consumed and renewed. Light and smoke melted together until destruction and beauty became almost indistinguishable. Through words and color, the fire was never forgotten, only transformed into something gentler, something the city could live with. For generations, the Great Fire stood as a warning, not of divine wrath, as some had once believed, but of carelessness and vulnerability. It taught builders to use stone and brick, to widen streets, to install fire hooks and buckets, to think of prevention rather than reaction. Each new generation of city planners looked back to that week in 1666 and quietly promised not to repeat it. By the 1700s, Londoners held regular fire drills. Watchmen patrolled the streets at night, listening for the crackle of danger. Insurance companies, a new invention of the age, sent inspectors to check the safety of homes and shops. And on the doors of insured houses, small plaques of tin and brass began to appear, each marked with the emblem of the company. A phoenix, a sunburst, a rising flame. Even in that practical way, the fire remained present. Its lesson was built into the very walls of the city. Still, for many years, the fire carried a shadow, the question of guilt. Thomas Fariner, the baker, lived out his life insisting he was not to blame. He had gone to bed that night, he said, certain the coals were out. It was his maid who first saw the flames, and she, tragically, was the fire's first victim. For decades afterward, people spoke his name in half-truths, some with pity, some with anger. But in time, his story, too, softened. He became less a culprit than a symbol of how easily human error can change the course of history. By the 19th century, the tone of memory had changed completely. The Great Fire was no longer a wound, it was a parable, a story told not in anger, but in awe. Centuries passed. London grew into an empire's capital, vast, loud, unstoppable. The fire that had once destroyed the city now felt distant, almost mythical. Yet every so often something would bring it back, a discovery in the archives, a school lesson, a new painting, a small spark of curiosity. And always it returned in the same way, not as terror, but as fascination. Children visiting the monument would look up and try to imagine the flames. Tour guides spoke softly about Pudding Lane, about the wind, about the baker's spark that had changed everything. Writers walked the same streets, tracing the outlines of vanished alleys. It became part of London's rhythm of remembering, not grief, but gentle reflection. Even in the 20th century, when new fires came with bombs and smoke, the city remembered that it had already burned once and survived. The lesson of 1666 whispered again, the city endures. If you look closely at London's map today, the memory of the fire is still visible, not in monuments, but in shapes. The way the streets curve slightly differently near the old city walls. The sudden widenings of lanes that once served as fire breaks, the empty spaces where churches once stood. These are the quiet footprints of 1666, the places where heat and flame redrew the earth itself. Even the city's skyline owes its grace to that destruction. The pale dome of St. Paul's, serene and unshakable, would not exist without the fire that took its predecessor. In that sense, the fire was never entirely an ending. It was a beginning wearing the disguise of loss. As centuries went by, people began to use the Great Fire as a metaphor. Writers spoke of it when describing renewal, reform, or rebirth. The fire became a symbol of change, of something old giving way to something necessary and new. Poets compared it to the human spirit, that curious thing that can fall, burn, and still rise again. Painters saw in it the glow of transformation. Philosophers saw in it the balance between chaos and creation. And perhaps that is why the story endures, because it is not only London's story, but a human one. To lose, to rebuild, to remember. Even now, if you walk through the quiet streets of the old city at dusk, you can feel it, not fear, but something softer. The air still carries a faint echo of that long-ago week when everything changed. It is in the way the light falls on stone, the way the wind turns corners, the way the bells of St. Paul's linger in the air a little longer than they need to. The fire has become memory, and memory has become peace. Time has done its work, sanding down the edges of tragedy until only meaning remains, and that meaning is quiet, enduring, still warm, like the final ember of a long-ago flame. London, in its endlessness, remembers in its own way, not through tears, but through architecture, not through lament, but through continuity. The Great Fire is not marked by mourning anymore, but by the slow turning of the seasons, the rebuilding of walls, and the sound of footsteps along streets that once glowed red with heat. The city is quiet again. The years have piled one upon another like bricks, and the streets that once glowed with fire now rest beneath soft pools of lamplight. Listen closely, and you can hear it, the low murmur of London breathing. A sound not of engines or footsteps, but of continuity. The slow exhalation of a city that has burned, rebuilt, and learned how to endure. The fire sleeps now. It rests, folded deep beneath the stone and dust, in the old heart of the city. Its work is finished. Every city, in its own way, has a rhythm. London's rhythm is one of survival. From the Roman walls buried beneath modern foundations, to the medieval alleys lost beneath glass towers, to the ashes of 1666, it has always found a way to breathe again. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but always with the same steady pulse. Fall, rebuild, remember. It is a rhythm that mirrors life itself, the cycle of loss and renewal. of endings that quietly become beginnings. When you walk those streets today, you walk through time. Beneath your feet are layers of forgotten stone, one city sleeping beneath another, and another still deeper down, each one whispering its story to the next. Memory has a strange texture. At first it feels heavy, sharp-edged, insistent, but time smooths it down, softens it, until it feels like silk in the mind. The memory of the Great Fire once carried pain and loss and fear. Now it carries peace. It is no longer a wound, but a scar, faint, pale, beautiful in its own way. In this quiet hour, the fire becomes something else entirely. It becomes a metaphor for all that we survive. Imagine, if you will, standing in the heart of the old city, long after the day has ended. The streets are nearly empty, the air is cool, and as you breathe, you can almost feel the faintest warmth rising from the stones. Not real heat, not anymore, but the echo of all that once was. It is a comforting warmth, like a memory of sunlight on your hands, a reminder that even the fiercest flame can one day become gentle. Somewhere beneath your feet, the dust of old London still lies, the ash of timbers, the soot of forgotten fires. But from that dust grew everything you see around you, the domes, the markets, the quiet courtyards where ivy grows. All of it, rising from what was lost. The city breathes, and with each breath it remembers. What did the Great Fire truly mean? Perhaps it was not simply a tragedy or a warning. Perhaps it was a reminder that nothing, not even destruction, is permanent. The wooden city was always meant to become a city of stone. The crowded lanes were meant to open into light. Even the lost carried a strange gift within it, the opportunity to begin again. In that way, the fire was not only an ending, it was a transformation written in flame. When dawn came on the final day of the fire, London stood silent beneath a sky the color of pale smoke. The air was cool, clean, empty. The noise had gone. Only the soft crackle of embers remained, like the sound of pages turning. That stillness, that pause between what was lost and what would come next, was the city's moment of peace. Every great change carries such a silence, the quiet between breaths, the hush before rebuilding begins. In that silence, London began again, and in this silence, centuries later, it still rests, breathing, remembering. You might imagine yourself there, walking through the empty streets of early morning. The air smells faintly of rain and dust. Your footsteps echo softly, as though the city itself is listening. There is no fire now, only calm, only the quiet hum of life continuing. Somewhere, a bell tolls from St. Paul's. Its sound drifts through the still air, low, slow, and resonant, each note fading gently into the next. As you listen, you might notice that your own breath has fallen into rhythm with it. Steady, measured, peaceful. You are breathing with the city, and the city, in its own way, breathes with you. If you close your eyes, you can imagine the fire as a great living thing that has finally found rest. No longer raging, no longer consuming, just sleeping, deep beneath the streets it once devoured. Its dreams are quiet now. Dreams of warmth, not destruction. Dreams of renewal. The fire sleeps, and above it life goes on. Soft, steady, serene. Overhead, clouds drift slowly across the night sky. The lights of London shimmer like embers, small, glowing points scattered across the darkness. Each one is alive, a story, a reminder that the city still lives. The air carries the faint scent of rain on stone. The Thames moves quietly beneath its bridges, its surface dark and smooth as silk. The breath of the city rises and falls, a rhythm so steady, so ancient, that you can almost mistake it for your own. This is the heartbeat of London, slow, eternal, forgiving. The Great Fire began as a spark, it ended as a city reborn. And somewhere between those two moments, between loss and creation, lies the quiet truth of all things, that life continues, that we endure, that even ashes can cradle the promise of light. The fire sleeps, the city breathes, the night is calm, and so, you may rest too.